Okay, Assalamu alaikum everybody, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome to our favorite day of the week, Saturday, Halakha day. We're excited to have day 5 of Surah Nisa. I just want to start with a couple of announcements. If you guys weren't able to look at my weekly email yesterday, we have a couple of very exciting events coming up. One of which is tomorrow at 4 o'clock. It's a virtual conversation. The Sheikh is going to be giving a keynote and kicking off a series that is being hosted by the Noor Cultural Center in Toronto, Canada. And the topic is what Islam looks like in public. And the description is that, let me read this to you, Dr. Cornel West famously said that justice is what love looks like in public. Inspired by this quote, this series will consider what Islam might look like in public. What are the implications of Islamic spiritual and ethical principles for contemporary struggles of gender, racial, economic, animal, ecological, and decolonial justice? The series will begin with a keynote from eminent scholar Dr. Abul Fadl, one of the world's leading authorities on Sharia, Islamic law, and Islam, and a prominent scholar in the field of human rights. So clearly this is a topic that we have been covering here with the halakas, how Islam should look in every aspect of life. So this will be a really wonderful conversation. It's actually a Q&A, or I should say it's an engagement. So it's often I think very wonderful to hear when the Sheikh just answers questions, and so it's like an engagement between Aziza Khan, who is from the Noor Center. If you recall, she actually engaged the Sheikh right before we started Project Illumine on the topic of the Quran. And so this was like back in June, I think, of 2020, or maybe August of 2020. And I feel like a lot of these, conversations are really the most powerful because they really, address the things that we're confronting today, and there's a really nice energy. So I hope that you'll join us. It's at 4 o'clock in the afternoon Eastern time. You can find the login information. It's going to be live streamed, but we'll also share the recording afterwards. So that's in my weekly email. You can also look up Noor Center, N-O-O-R Center, C-E-N-T-R-E, and they're going to be live streaming on YouTube and Facebook, or sorry, just on YouTube, but you can find their information on Facebook. The second event right now is just a save the date, but it's a really important event. The date is Sunday, March 20th, which is about a month away, and it's going to be focused on the whole issue of sexual abuse and spiritual abuse at the hands of religious scholars, particularly in our community, which has obviously become a very big issue, and it's a really taboo issue. If you recall, the Sheikh talked about this in a couple of his khutbahs, which were extremely powerful and well received. I think we know everyone knows someone who's been touched by this issue. Although people don't talk about it, there's a lot of confusion. There is a lot of rhetoric, and so we thought it would be a really good opportunity to come up with frequently asked questions, things that are, there are a lot of misconceptions around. It's a sensitive topic, so we're trying to be very, very careful about how we handle this, and also to try and address the questions I think most people have on their minds. And so it'll be a really interesting curated Q&A. We're still working through it, but if anyone would like to volunteer, we actually would love to have some people who would help us with asking questions that we have predetermined would be most interesting to most people. So if you are interested in volunteering and being with us, definitely email me and get in contact. So that will be great. And the last thing that I thought I would mention, just to start, is Sharif actually shared with me a video that was on YouTube. I haven't taken the time to really delve in yet, but I wanted to share this with you. There's a website called solaceuk.org, and SOLACEUK.org. They are an organization out of the UK that help Muslim converts who oftentimes find themselves in a very common situation. They convert to Islam, they find that they're alone, they feel that they are estranged from their families and friends. Oftentimes they come across well-intentioned Muslims, people who encourage them to quickly get married. They, get married, find themselves, pressured to be in that situation, oftentimes end up marrying people who are abusive. They're very green when it comes to, like Islam. And so they find themselves being told certain things like, oh, you should get married, you should have children, you should have this, you should have that. And oftentimes they end up in a very bad way. And then they turn to the Muslim community for help, and oftentimes find that the Muslim community is not open to helping them. And then they're oftentimes alone and lost. And, it's a horrible situation. This group put together a very powerful video. Again, Solace, SOLACE, UK.org. And I know enough to know that they've been, for the last, I think, 7 years, helping reverts, people who have, women who oftentimes will end up, not married, they're divorced, now they have kids. They have, they have been estranged from their families, so they can't go back home to their families. There's, they don't have a lot of Muslim friends. Nowhere to turn, no money, in a desperate situation. And so this group reaches out and helps these women. And so it's a really sad, common situation that happens with converts. And I wish that we had a US version of this. But, maybe through just sharing this, someone would be in a position to at least connect with them, find out what they do, create something here in the US, because I know personally people who have been in that situation. This video is very powerful because it kind of shows from a woman's perspective what she encounters, how she got to the situation she was and where she ends up, why she's so desperate, and why, she is oftentimes thinking about why did I even convert? Why am I Muslim? It was so painful but so common. So anyway, take a look at the video. I'm going to do a little bit more research too, but it just, reminded me of like what a vulnerable situation a lot of converts are in. They find Islam, they're excited, they don't know, what to expect. And then if they encounter the wrong people that give them the wrong advice, they find themselves in a horrible situation. And honestly, like what we can do as Muslims who encounter young converts is just to encourage them to continue to educate themselves and not to make any commitments like marriage and having kids right away, just to feel stable and grounded in their new adopted faith, and take it slowly. It's a really serious situation. So and it happens to so many people that it's really tragic, and it's highlights everything that we are weak in as a Muslim community in terms of reaching out to converts and people in need in general. So just wanted to share that with you. And anyway, I am so excited and looking forward to another amazing session tonight. Thank you for joining us. And inshallah, here we go.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Subhanallah, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. والصلاة والسلام على محمد وعلى آله وعلى أصحابه المهتدين وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. You said 54? So I think we stopped at 54. And some just of the basic and critical highlights before we continue. That again, Surah Nisa starts out with an overall encompassing principle that humanity is one. It progresses from that to a series of social reforms through the instrumentality of law, but at the same time, it is addressing a living community and an open discursive situation. I mean, it is a situation that is evolving, because you are dealing with human beings, and human beings suffer from numerous weaknesses, and these weaknesses pull onto human beings towards the elements of hypocrisy. And so it is not just sufficient to tell them, well, here are the reforms, but what is necessary is to go beyond and talk about the transformations within that are necessary for these reforms to take hold and to become meaningful. Because if you just change, if you just rely on law to change things for you, but law is acting as the exclusive agent for change, then law will break under the strain. The nature of law is that it has enforcement mechanisms that kick in by the very logic of law only when there are occasional departures. So in other words, it's like someone herding sheep. You don't find the person herding sheep disciplining every and single sheep in the herd. If the herder had to do that, it would become an impossible task. Rather, the herder leads by demonstrating examples. In other words, waving a stick towards some sheep in a certain direction and relying on the compliance of the some to lead the many. You have to have a flock that is instinctively cooperative. Now, of course, with sheep, it's easy because with sheep, you don't have, sheep are sheep. Imagine if the sheep were all endowed with independent intellects, and each and every single sheep needed persuasion. Imagine how difficult the herding process would become. Because it wouldn't be enough that you tell a single sheep turn right and the rest would follow. You would actually have to address every single one. So managing human beings is difficult. And law relies on 99% compliance, voluntary compliance, and 1% discipline. So when there is the occasional breach, law steps in and says, okay, I will respond to the breach. But in order for law to work, you need people to internally be in sync with what law is doing. If people are not in sync with what law is doing, people end up obstructing the law. And the law end up breaking under the strain. That's how legal systems stop functioning, stop working. Is that the law, for instance, says you should not take bribes. Right? But the social dynamics that exist in society are such that 90% of the population takes bribes. What is the law going to do? Well, then the enforcement of law itself can become an injustice, because what happens is the law will punish just a few while the vast majority get away. And the fact that only a few is punished when the many are in fact in breach is itself an injustice, an inequity. And subhanAllah, we find that that is why the treatment of the Quran in every surah in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about law, we find at the same time in the surah goes beyond law to address the spirits and hearts and souls of people. Because the transformation has to be in sync with the law. And so as we saw, not just the social reforms that are all within a trajectory of empowerment, especially the elements in society that are traditionally disempowered. But as we saw, that then we have these critical, foundational moral principles like لا تزكوا أنفسكم, don't commend yourself. That this dynamic doesn't, and we've talked about this plenty, that this dynamic does not work unless you understand all the dangers in someone that says, I believe, but I am entitled. I believe, but instead of being critical about my ethical being, I simply accept the way I am, and I lack that critical insight. Or, as we saw, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes and warns us against or highlights the impossibility, not just tension, but beyond tension. Because it's a paradox that to say, I am a believer, but at the same time you believe in Jibt and Taghut, as we've talked about in the past halaqah. And as we said, that Jibt is to ascribe supernatural powers or mystical powers to a force other than Allah. So Jibt is to say, ultimate power can lie in nature, ultimate power can lie in the stars, ultimate power can lie in the motion of the planets. But all of that is under the general rubric of Jibt. And Taghut, Taghut is all forms of injustice. But beyond that, Taghut is always injustice mixed with oppression. The word Taghut itself always connotes a oppressive injustice. And if you recall, as we've talked about, that while in Quranic commentaries, you find the typical tendency of so many Muslim scholars of, especially in Sunni Islam, even much more than Shia Islam, of taking Quranic criticism and sort of saying and pushing Quranic criticism towards creating a safe distance between the reader and the Quranic criticism. And the typical way they do this is that they say, well, the Quran is really not talking about us. It's talking about Jews. It's talking about Christians. It's talking about the hypocrites that lived in Medina. In fact, in many ways, the irony of it is that to say, well, what the Quran says about Jibt and Taghut is limited either to non-Muslims or to a specific historical period that is now gone. And as I said in the past halaqah, there is absolutely no justification for that. And there is no evidence whatsoever that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warns us against those who believe in Jibt and Taghut and try to reconcile between Iman and Jibt and Taghut, and Allah basically says that's not going to work. It doesn't work. And you will not be on the path towards any form of salvation, whether on this life or in the rest. If in fact you believe in Jibt and Taghut, there is just simply no evidence that this was limited to Jews or Christians or even limited to a specific historical period, but it is a normative discourse that transcends the circumstance in which it was revealed, for which it was revealed. Okay. And as I think and we've talked about 54, where أم يحسدون الناس على ما آتاهم الله من فضله, that alerting you that, and I actually don't quite remember if I emphasized this because we were towards the end of the halaqah and I was getting tired, but understand when Allah tells you that people are drawn toward Jibt and Taghut, and that Jibt and Taghut have this corrupting influence that will prevent people from understanding the ethical, normative, plan of Islam. In other words, those who have a very difficult time and will have a very difficult time signing onto this project and understanding this project and progressing with this project, the Islamic project, that at the heart of the ailment itself is a lack of true acceptance and surrender to Allah as Malik al-Mulk, and that human beings will often err simply because of an emotion as base and as simple as in Nisa, يحسدون الناس, envy people. But note, we read this, يحسدون الناس على ما آتاهم الله, that they envy people for what God has given them. But note, look at the ayah itself. It doesn't talk about envying the material possessions of people. It talks about something much deeper. Because, and how does it alert you to that? It tells you, فَقَدْ آتَيْنَا آلِ إِبْرَاهِيمَ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ وَآتَيْنَاهُمْ مُلْكًا عَظِيمًا. It talks about envy in the context of who is given true learning and who is given true wisdom. It talks about envy in the context of the dynamics of history and the rise and fall of people through history. And you pause at this and say, well, what type of envy is the Quran really talking about here? I'll put it to you this way. Often people theoretically know what is right or wrong. What prevents people from giving rights their due? What often prevents people from treating each other in the way that they can abstractly understand people ought to be treated. What often prevents people from simply following the golden rule of do unto others as you would like done unto yourself is a sense of insecurity. In our modern language, it is often being threatened by others. The very base feeling of, well, why should I defer to another? Why should I accept the merit of another? How can I justify not relinquishing control where it is due to another? So you have a sense that, and this is often what happens with orphans, what happens with women, what happens with every disempowered member in society. Theoretically, yeah, we all understand. If someone is of a lower class and they are in your home, you should feed them the way you eat. They should dress the way you dress. There should be absolute equality. But how many people actually execute this? And if we're entirely honest with ourselves, we'd say practically none. Well, what prevents people from executing this? People throw all types of justifications. Well, if you start treating hired help in a certain way that will embolden them, they will start defying our orders. They will start thinking of themselves as equal to us. And we come up with all type, but when Allah says يحسدون الناس على ما أتاهم الله, that they envy people, what this is alluding to or going back to is Allah sort of shedding stark light upon the fact that this program of social reforms will be obstructed, and will be obstructed by people who are threatened, not because they are intellectually committed to obstructing the program, but because they are too weak in resisting their own base inclinations. It is the exception. Ill intentions in the commission of what is wrong is the exception, is not the rule. Most of the time, when people are unfair to those who are unequal in power, it is not that they start out with the intent to harm. There's the vast majority of time there's no malicious intent. The vast majority of time, people simply succumb to weakness. They justify to themselves not doing what is right. And the way they justify it is by responding to their own insecurities. Put differently, their own jealousies. I feel threatened. And if I feel threatened, we rarely admit that, well, I feel threatened because I'm not strong enough and I need to work on myself. No, I feel threatened because for all the different reasons that we come up with for why you feel threatened. Okay. And this is and some commentators did notice that أم يحسدون الناس على ما آتاهم, and then when Allah says, well, we've given Ibrahim the book and wisdom, and there number of commentators are just passed over it and said, well, we're not sure why the reference to Ibrahim in this context. But some did pause and speak at length. It's saying, well, this is it's like Allah is speaking to the entire Muslim Ummah and saying, keep in mind that the pitfall of those before you is that often when it comes, and as we will see, because it then goes into a concrete example of what is intended, is that this inability to overcome your own insecurities and to be at peace with the fact that Allah is the owner of the universe, Malikul Mulk, and that why is someone smarter? Why is someone more talented? Why is someone right? Why is someone inspired with this or that? This is all up to Allah, and you focus on the substance, not on you, not whether the truth threatens me, but on forcing yourself to embrace the truth regardless of whether it threatens you. Okay. And then, of course, I will. Okay, I'll pause with on فمنهم من آمن به ومنهم من صد عنه وكفى بجهنم سعيرا. It's as this will be re-engaged in Surah Nisa again, but repeatedly in Surah An-Nisa, as in other surah that are revealed in the Medina period, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to the fact that the Muslim Ummah at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, although the Ahl al-Hadith people tend to have the rather odd position that all those who lived and converted to Islam at the time of the Prophet and encountered the Prophet are Sahaba. That's not an usuli position. The usuli position is that it is not enough that you simply have encountered the Prophet ﷺ, but in fact, in order to be among the Sahaba, you have to have companionship, طول الصحبة, that you have had to have, and then the usulis themselves have discussions as to what counts as a sufficient companionship and what counts as a close relationship. Now, why am I mentioning this? Because as is in Surah An-Nisa, as is in Surah revealed after Surah An-Nisa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is constantly pointing out that even those who are living at the time of the Prophet ﷺ and had converted to Islam at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, it is not simply smooth sailing, that the ideals of Islam, Quranic Islam, the contemporaries of the Prophet struggled, some of them rising to the challenge, but many of them failing to rise up or to reach when 55, when Allah says, some of them have turned, some of them have in fact embraced and understood, this is not about you, this is about principles, this is about rights, this is about justice. Whether you yourself, you're threatened by it, whether you yourself feel insecure because women are being given rights, or orphans are being given rights, or slaves are being given rights, and you find this too radical, and so on. That the reality is that in Medinian society itself, there are some who committed themselves to embracing the entire program of Muslim moral reform. But there are many who struggle with themselves, who, although they conceptually understand what Allah is demanding, but they don't necessarily succeed in execution. And again, the reason I'm flagging 55 is because of the tendency, especially among Sunni scholars, that they look at a verse like 55 and say, oh, well, this is talking about Jews and Christians. Again, this goes back to a much bigger topic about how do we deal with the issue of justice in the very early centuries of Islam, and whether we pretend that, quote unquote, all the companions of the Prophet perfectly executed the Islamic project, or do we acknowledge that, well, many of who we call companions were not companions? And even among those who we call companions, they were human, and they struggled, and they succeeded to different levels. to different extents. This is a very, very big issue, because if you commit yourself to the idea that no, all of them were companions and all of them perfectly executed, then you hit quite a predicament. What is the predicament? You look at the tradition, the historical record of the companions that you've said have all executed the Islamic project perfectly, or for the most part successfully even. And then you encounter events in Islamic history that cannot be moral. And if you obfuscate the moral issue, then you've obfuscated Islamic morality forever. So, if you come to an event in which there is a clear, the historical record is such that there is an injustice committed by someone that you've called a companion, and that you have committed yourself to the idea that this companion is a perfect reflection of Islamicity. And then you find this companion has done something that is very unjust. You have a choice. Either you concede, you say, well, you call injustice injustice, and you say, oh, this companion messed up. Or either you say he's not a companion, or even if you call him a companion, you say this companion messed up. And that they were human, just like we are human. And they struggled, just like we struggle. Or you say, no, I'm going to call whatever they do, I'm going to stretch interpretation to say that whatever they do is fair and just. But if you do that, then recognizing justice becomes nearly an impossible project. So if you, for instance, read that a companion of the Prophet like Hijr bin Adi, he was a Badri, he was one of the, in Bay'at al-Ridwan, he was one of the people who fought in Badr, he was an early, a very close companion of the Prophet ﷺ for at least 10 years, give or take. Very close to Imam Ali, but eventually Hijr bin Adi is executed by people who should have known better. So you come to this execution and you either have to say, because we'll see in Surah Nisa, because Surah Nisa, subhanAllah, it's as if Allah is like laying things out for us that will unfold in history. Because Surah Nisa will talk about killing people unjustly. So either you come to this and say, well, you know, it's possible that pious people can use an interpretation and end up going as far as taking the life of other pious people. And we shouldn't be sticklers about it. You know, it's excusable. Although Allah said it's not excusable. And you commit yourself to this moral obfuscation, or you have to call things as they are and say, no, the execution of Hijr bin Adi was immoral, and those who were involved in the execution of Hizb al-Adi, even if they were companions of the Prophet, meaning they accompanied the Prophet for X number of years, they've committed a grave sin. You see, history presents you with these challenges. So what Sunni scholars, not all of them, but what they often did is that they would come to an ayah like 55 because they are aware of these issues we're talking about. And what Sunni scholars would say is, oh, well, you know, when ayah 55 says that some of them have, in fact, embraced the project, and some of them are in resistance, they are having a very hard time, in fact, carrying the Quranic project to fruition. They say, well, it's talking about Jews and Christians, and therefore avoid the entire moral confrontation. But when we do that, we impoverish the Quran. And we end up where we are today. We have lofty principles, but we have loftier excuses for not implementing the principles. Our excuses are bigger than the principles themselves. I submit to you, this goes even back to our confusion as to the relationship between law and ethics. We often make law supreme and ethics inferior to law. That's completely turned around. It's like making a statute, making a statute superior to a constitutional principle. It doesn't work. What ends up happening is that it means you have no constitutional principles. If statutory law is inferior to constitutional principles, that necessarily means there are no constitutional principles. Similarly, if positive law is superior to ethical principles, or if positive law defines ethical principles, that necessarily means you have no ethical principles. Now, if you don't have ethical principles, how the heck can you understand the Quran? Then how can you make sense of the Quran? When the Quran in its entirety is an ethical project. So, you've completely mixed al-muhkam wal-mutashabih. And we've talked about this, right? You've completely confused the whole purpose of Allah telling you there are overriding principles and there are applications of these principles. And don't get confused as to the hierarchy of things, because hierarchy entails priority and entails orderly thinking. The first thing when we try to train a student, what is the first thing you teach them? If you pack a student's brain with data, that's not an education. That's like a parrot. They have a lot of data, they can regurgitate a lot of data, but they don't know how to think. So what is education about? Education is about methodology. How to think. How to analyze. Okay, but what is in its essence? What is methodology? Pause and ask yourself. In essence, what is methodology? It's orderly thinking. What questions come first? what questions follow from the prior questions, what questions follow from the secondary questions, and so on. It's orderly thinking. For every system of knowledge, you need orderly thinking. It's like mathematics. You know, you can't tell someone jump to calculus before first they learn the basics of algebra. It's impossible. It doesn't work. But this is precisely what we've done with the Quran. We completely ignore the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us to think about morality and say, give us knowledge without order. Well, knowledge without order is just data. So give us data. If you carry data around, you only carry commands that you don't understand. And commands that you don't understand, that's robotic. And regardless of how good a robotic agent you are, you will not come even close to fulfilling the Quranic project. Because the Quran is not about robots. The Quran is about thinking people, moral agents, people who can say, okay, here's the principle, and I must have clear thinking as to how I strive towards the principle. That requires honesty, transparency, structured thinking. Because otherwise, you say, well, here is the principle, and I will pretend that I fulfilled the principle by discharging some mechanical robotic act. Then the entire thing collapses. Okay. Okay, so 56 and 57 obviously underscore accountability and the very principle of reward and punishment. And then we get to 58, which, like earlier, when in Surah Nisa, where Allah gives us the specific and then pulls back to the general. And like before, Allah told us that understand that you have an obligation to bear witness, and that the Prophet ﷺ himself will bear witness, be a witness upon you. You are a witnesser and a witnessee. Then Allah pulls back and comes and says to us, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرَكُمْ أَن تُؤَدُّوا الْأَمَانَاتِ إِلَى أَهْلِهَا وَإِذَا حَكَمْتُمْ بَيْنَ النَّاسِ أَن تَحْكُمُوا بِالْعَدْلِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ نَعِمَّ مَا يَعِظُكُمْ بِهِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ سَمِيعًا بَصِيرًا. This is 58. يا أيها الذين آمنوا أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول وأولي الأمر منكم فإن تنازعتم في شيء فردوه إلى الله والرسول إن كنتم تؤمنون بالله واليوم الآخر ذلك خير وأحسن تأويلا. ألم تر إلى الذين يزعمون أنهم آمنوا بما أنزل إليك وما أنزل من قبلك يريدون أن يتحاكموا إلى الطاغوت وقد أمروا أن يكفروا به ويريد الشيطان أن يضلهم ضلالا بعيدا. This is now 60. وإذا قيل لهم تعالوا إلى ما أنزل الله وإلى الرسول رأيت المنافقين يصدون عنك صدودا. Okay. So then it's as if Allah is telling us, okay, you want to understand what this is all about. Why does Allah need you to understand the dynamic of witnessing? Why does Allah need you to understand that you shouldn't commend yourself? Why does Allah need you to institute all these reforms? Why does Allah need you not to subscribe to Taghut and Jibt and resist Taghut in your life and Jibt in your life? Why does Allah need you not to surrender to your insecurities and your base sense of jealousy and envy, that what becomes important to you is whether you're threatened by someone, not whether someone is actually saying or doing anything that is right? Because we often fail to do what's right simply because it's an ego thing. The whole issue of envy, it's alerting us to the dangers of the ego. You are egotistical people as human beings. And the reason that you often fail is because of your egos. Your egos get bruised. You don't do what's right often, most often, and maybe in our age, nearly always, because of your egos. You surrender to your egos. That's your taghut. You don't surrender to Allah. Your taghut is your ego. And especially in the age of individualism and the age in which, people are not raised with any sense of examples or, any sense of deference to generations or to wisdom or to, all the ailments of modernity and the modern age. You want to know what this is all about? Understand, reflect, comprehend that this is about amanat, and the way we teach this to our children is so bad, is so wrong, is so inadequate. This is about giving. Amana is a trust, right? This is 50. Yeah, Muhammad, as it says, to deliver all that you have been entrusted with unto those who are entitled to it. Okay? So, amanat, and tu'addu al-amanat ila ahliha. You are entrusted, as human beings, you are entrusted with an amana. Give it where it is due. We raise modern Muslims the way you are taught the amana is that, well, what the Quran is talking about is that if someone, says, hold on to this for me, is that you return it. Oh, you go and you ask your friend, can I borrow your vacuum cleaner? Oh yeah, you can borrow my vacuum cleaner. So make sure you give it back. Really? All this hoopla so that you return the vacuum cleaner? أن تؤدوا الأمانات إلى أهلها. As Al-Wahidi says, all relations in life constitutes an amana. All relations in life constitutes an amana. And therefore Al-Wahidi says, حقوق الناس أمانات ولذلك فالقول يشمل العدل ورد المظالم. The rights of people are amanat. They're trust chips. If any time I have a right, that right is a trust due to me by anyone who owes me that right. Now, imagine if we had actually anchored that in our understanding. When you have a right to speak and someone comes and denies you that right, they've taken out, they didn't give you the amana. They've betrayed you, your amana. You have a right, it wasn't given to you. If I have a right to be sheltered and I'm denied that, if I have a right to be fed and I'm denied that, as Imam al-Ghazali said, if you owe someone Assalamu alaikum and you don't say it, you've denied them the amana. If you owe someone a smile and you deny them, you've denied them an amana. So, أن تؤدوا الأمانات إلى أهلها. Understand that your entire existence is about what you owe and what you are owed. And that is sacrosanct. And that you cannot do that. Why do we need these social reforms? Because you have to understand, people, that it is all about what you owe people and what you are owed. What we in our modern language call a system of rights. But even al-Wahidi, who was writing in the medieval period, said, حقوق الناس أمانات. The rights of people are amanat. Which, could be rendered, literally translated to our modern age language, and it would sound like, the writings of some very liberal, westernized thinker. And it's not. But it is the Quranic Islam. Because, sure, after the end of the rightly guided Khulafa, the despotic governments that come to power, they don't want people to think in these sense. Now people are going to say our rights are amanat held by the state. So of course, you guys don't have even an idea of how many scholars perished at the hands of unjust rulers throughout history, precisely to avoid this Quranic thinking. Yes, they are Islamic in label, and they go and they fight wars in the name of Islam, but whether they in fact wanted the Quranic Islam, the prophetic Islam, is something completely different. Because that is extremely dangerous if you have people say, my rights are an amana held by whoever can grant me my rights, or whoever has the power to hold back my rights. The entire fabric of the way we deal with each other is the sum total of amanat that we hold towards one another. So, in fact, understand, when you fail to give a share of the inheritance to someone who worked in your household for 20, 30 years and was a member of the family until the patriarch died, and now they're going to end up in the street, and you fail to make them safe and secure, understand that you actually transgressed upon an amana that you owed them. They had a right, and you failed to give them that right. Completely revolutionary way of thinking. And then Allah underscores this, as Al-Wahidi points out, and understand that the point is amanat, and that all decision making, all judgments vis-a-vis one another must be according to the principles of justice. Now, note here, it doesn't say according to the principles of law. It's not the matter of execute positive law. There is a bigger substantive project at stake here, and that is the project of substantive justice. And God, if only Muslims understood. Inna Allah ni'imma ya'izukum bih. God, you can pause at this, and it makes you just tremble. If only you understood, it's as if Allah is saying, if only you understood the importance and the beauty of what Allah is telling you to follow. So it's like a way of underscoring that I've just given you something extremely valuable. That your life is about the amanat you owe each other and the justice that you owe each other. Now, as some in the Islamic tradition pointed out to the obvious, well, that requires a sustained, principled commitment and thorough thinking about how we achieve Radd al-Amanat, giving rights where they're due, and justice, al-adl, tahqiq al-adl in every age, because every age has its own challenges, and every period and every situation has its own complexities. But if you understand that this is what it's about, then you can never afford not to discuss the issue. Does this constitute Radd al-Amanat? Does this constitute the achievement of justice? When Allah says, "Ni'imma ya'izukum bih," it's like saying, let's see how actually Muhammad Asa translated it. Let's say, whenever you judge with justice, verily most excellent is what God exhorts you to do. Yeah, I mean, it's like Allah saying, if you only understood the importance of this. Okay. Then, probably one of the most famous ayat in the Islamic tradition, 59. Believers, obey Allah, obey the Prophet, wa ulil amr minkum. Muhammad Asa translates it as those who have been entrusted with authority. So obey Allah, obey the Prophet, and obey ulil amri minkum. Just hold on to that caveat. Who are the ulil amri minkum? Muhammad Asa translates it as those who have been entrusted with authority amongst you. فَإِن تَنَازَعْتُمْ فِي شَيْءٍ, and if you disagree about something, then the decisive then the matter returns to Allah and the Prophet. Okay. And that is again underscored with إن كنتم تؤمنون بالله واليوم الآخر, if in fact you are real believers. So if you fail to do this, you are not real believers. ذلك خير وأحسن تأويلا. And again, when the Quran says things like that, it's like Allah saying, this is real wisdom if you only understood. We often pass over these statements of emphasis where Allah alerts us to how to, it's like Allah teaches us the methodology of moral thinking by saying, here are the a priori principles that you start with. Okay. So we pause for a second and say, why is 59 so famous? Well, 59 is so famous because of the way it was co-opted and often corrupted by despots in Islamic history. Why? Because obey God, obey the Prophet, wa ulil amri minkum, and from the first dynasty in Islam to our very day, it's say, well, that means obey God, obey the Prophet, and obey whoever is in power. So today, even among the what's their name? I'm blanking out about the Madakhila. The Madakhila, this Salafi sect that that all dictatorial governments rely on now in the Middle East. That you have to obey Muhammad bin Salman blindly, you have to obey Muhammad bin Zayed blindly, you have to obey Sisi blindly, you have to obey Haftar blindly. The Madakhila, the number of times that they cite you of this particular verse, obey God, obey the Prophet, and obey those, and then for them, okay, those who ulil amri minkum are those who have the gun, who those who have the power to use force, and that becomes a principle that trumps all. So justice doesn't matter, ethics really don't matter, nothing really matters. All that matters is that God says, obey God, obey the Prophet, and obey rulers in power. Well, the amount of corruption in this is incredible, because notice first, what comes before it and what comes after it. This is sandwiched between injunctions as to a system of due rights, the necessity of giving rights their due, and the necessity of justice. And it is immediately followed, as we will see, with a prohibition against at-tahakum ila taghut. It is immediately followed with Allah saying, but this can never mean that what holds sway or what becomes supreme and authoritative among you is injustice, is taghut, is oppression. So that's one. So it's plucking the ayah completely out of context. 2, from the very earliest commentaries in the Quran to ones that were written much later. The majority didn't actually say that ulil amri minkum. It is talking about rulers in power. The majority said ulil amri minkum are those in society who embody the message of Allah and the Prophet ﷺ. And then there is which in concrete terms for the majority of scholars were either Ahlul Bayt, the family of the Prophet ﷺ, that they are the natural inheritors of Allah and the Prophet. So it is talking about authoritativeness within, moral authoritativeness within the community. It is not talking about compulsory powers of the state. It is talking about moral deference. So it's either the family of the Prophet, and then many other scholars said, no, it is the pious and most knowledgeable and most ethical ulama, scholars. Now, of course, the state has led centuries-old battle and persecuted tons of scholars over this particular ayah. Because every time a scholar would say, ulil amri minkum are those who carry moral authority. So what it's saying is, when you, because listen, it is in the context of justice, rights, and avoidance of taghut, of oppression. So it's saying, when you want to find your way as to what God and the Prophet wants, if you go from, let me ask what God wants, let me ask what the Prophet wants, and then whoever embodies these, remember we said moral thinking is orderly thinking. So I go from God, I don't put the Prophet before God, God before the Prophet, and the Prophet before the Ahlul Bayt or the scholars. And I go in this orderly fashion. So I want to understand what God wants, what God's commands are, what God's will is. Next step, the Prophet. Next step, whoever embodies. So it is not, it's not talking about structural power. It is talking about moral deference, moral authority. And as proof of that, they said, at the time, the Prophet ﷺ was the ruler. And the Quran would come and say, obey Allah, the Prophet, and rulers amongst you. Well, there was only one ruler, the Prophet. So it made, and as we will see later on in Surah Nisa, what it's talking about is, understand that Allah, the Prophet, and then those who are like Imam Abu Bakr or Umar or Ali, who carry the moral weight and authority of Allah and the Prophet. These are the people that you should go to resolve your confusions, your questions. It is not talking about obeying Muhammad bin Salman or obeying Sisi. If you can find the equivalent in our day and age of those who bear the moral authority, and then it comes to, it's not saying, and then if you disagree about with ulil amri minkum. No, it is saying if you disagree amongst yourself about anything, فَإِن تَنَازَعْتُمْ, if you end up confused or conflicted or have a disagreement about anything, then understand the constitutional frame of reference is what Allah and the Prophet, Allah first and then the Prophet wants. The authority of ulil amr, the authority of whether Ahlul Bayt or the scholars is merely derivative. They are to be obeyed to the extent they explain to us or represent to us the will of Allah as a priori, and as a secondary matter, the will of the Prophet ﷺ. But beyond that, that is the moral gravitational anchor. From the time the Umayyads came to power, from the very first Umayyad Khalifa, Muawiyah, immediately Muawiyah would literally bring scholars and say, Ulil Amr minkum, this is talking about me, isn't it? And if they say no, they would be imprisoned, tortured, and sometimes executed. But it is through and through corruption, because the number of scholars who gave up their lives or their freedom or their well-being to uphold the principle that this is not talking about you Muawiyah or you Yazid or you Al-Malik bin Marwan or whoever. We're not taught this. We are not taught this in our schools. And so our children grow up completely unaware of the number of scholars who've sacrificed their lives. Like Al-Hijr bin Adi, who was a companion of the Prophet ﷺ, who absolutely refused to concede that this is talking about Muawiyah. So when an ummah has no historical memory, this is precisely what happens. Is that someone comes today in a khutbah and says, وَأَطِيعُوا أُولِي الْأَمْرِ مِنْكُمْ, and then they use that to say, just obey a ruler, and then he mixes this with a completely fabricated hadith, obey an unjust ruler even if they whip you and take your money and oppress you, and does this sort of mix and match process, and then what comes out is an ugly, intolerable Islam. What type of religion is that? That tells you obey unjust rulers, just accept injustice, submit yourself to injustice. Although, look at what follows, 60. أَلَمْ تَرَ الَّذِينَ يَزْعُمُونَ أَنَّهُمْ آمَنُوا بِمَا أُنزِلَ إِلَيْكَ وَمَا أُنزِلَ مِنْ قَبْلِكَ يُرِيدُونَ أَنْ يَتَحَاكَمُوا إِلَى الطَّاغُوتِ. Look at those who claim that they actually believe in you and believe in all the prophets. But what is their fundamental flaw? That they accept their frame of deference, what is authoritative for them, is not Radd al-Amanat, is not Amana, is not Adl, is not justice. It is not anchored in Allah and the Prophet ﷺ and the moral examples of divinity, of Ar-Rabbaniyya. Ulil Amri Minkum, the moral examples of divinity, of Rabbaniyya. But it is rather, they ultimately submit themselves to Taghut. So how could Allah have made it more clear of what Allah is talking about? That if you ultimately, okay, and what is tahakum ila taghut? What is tahakum ila taghut? What is acceptance, accepting the judgment of taghut? Well, first just show you what happens in tradition. As we said, there are a lot of institutions of power that have an invested interest in neutralizing the moral power of these words. In the same way that they didn't want Radd al-Amanat or Al-Adl to be the overriding principles because they're unjust rulers, and they know that. So, some of the most amazing invented traditions about this ayah 60. So you read in the tradition that a man called Al-Jallas bin al-Samit and Mu'tab bin Qushayr and some others, that they fought, they disagreed about something, and they said, okay, well, we need an arbitrator because we can't resolve this. And so they decided to go to a man called Barza al-Aslami. They decided to go to Barza al-Aslami and to have him arbitrate. And Barza al-Aslami was a rabbi, a Jewish rabbi. And so you read in the tradition that, well, this ayah was revealed because by going to have their dispute arbitrated by Barz al-Aslami, a Jewish rabbi, instead of going to the Prophet, they are submitting to Taghut. It is another report says that Ibn Zubair and a man from the Ansar, I don't remember his name, had a disagreement about water rights over a spring. There's a spring of water, and they're regulating usage, and that ultimately they go to the Prophet ﷺ to resolve the dispute between them, and then the Prophet ﷺ issues a judgment that the man from the Ansar, not Ibn Zubair but the other man, the man who's a native Medinian, doesn't like what the Prophet ﷺ says or his judgment, and he says, I'm not going to accept this because you are biased in favor of your cousin. Because Ibn Zubair is a Meccan and from the same family, and so on. There is even a more, perhaps a more extreme report that two men had a disagreement, and they were brought to the Prophet ﷺ to judge between them. And the Prophet ﷺ then judged between them, ruled between them. And one of the men said, I'm not going to accept the judgment of the Prophet. I don't like the judgment, I'm not accepting it. And that upon this happening, Umar ibn al-Khattab killed that man. And that the Prophet ﷺ then did not condemn what Umar did. Now, of course, as you might anticipate, this last report is exactly the type of report that Islamophobes pounce on. And they put in there and they tell you, oh, it's in this book and that book. And of course, because Muslims are clueless, they read something like this and then they, I'm having a crisis of faith. How could the Prophet kill a man that just because he didn't accept the judgment of the Prophet and the Prophet didn't even say anything and so on. And perhaps you wouldn't be surprised that when you look at this last report, for instance, it originates or among the main transmitters of the report is a man called Abi Lahi'a, and or in some Abu Lahi'a, and this man was closely allied to just for the interest of simplifying things, was a fabricator of hadith, and a fabricator of hadith in favor of despots. But even the first two narratives, the one in which makes the yatahakamu ila taghut, about going to a Jewish rabbi to arbitrate, is also has within the chain of transmissions, these are the transmitters who were closely allied to the authoritarian project of Islamic dynasties. In other words, when the Umayyads came to power, the Umayyads claimed to be God's caliphs, Khulafa'ullah, and they claimed absolute authority. And they had their favorite transmitters of hadith. Why? Because these were people that were transmitting hadith that ultimately either neutralized the revolutionary impact of the Quran, made Muslims more compliant, easier to rule over, or outright supporters of absolute monarchical power, absolute despotism, and and so although many of these muhaddithun were accepted by Bukhari and accepted by Tirmidhi and so on, but in my book, their credibility is suspect, and I don't accept their hadith because they were favored by the state, spoiled by the state, embraced by the state, and not because they were great scholars, but they were because they were apologists for an authoritarian project. How the heck do you accept these as credible transmitters of hadith, especially that everything that comes from them is like the report here tells us that, when the Quran talks about accepting the judgment of Taghut, it's just talking about Jews and Christians. So don't worry about it. As long as you don't go to a Jew to adjudicate something, you're fine. So even the tradition that Ibn Zubair had a disagreement with an Ansari over water rights, and that it has in its chains of transmission transmitters who, put it mildly, did not like Ibn Zubair because they were part of an ideological project who it overlaps. It's very interesting. You look at these traditions, and then the politicization. It's like and then you research the people involved in transmitting that tradition to us, and the politics of these reports stirs you right in the face. On the other hand, generations of scholars who also didn't accept these traditions as occasions for revelation or as said, no, it is, go back to the language of the Quran. At the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there were many people who claimed they converted. They went to the Prophet and took the Shahada. But many of them either were not sincere about Muslim or were sincere but struggled with their Islamicity. It's not that they necessarily struggled with, oh, do I really believe that there's going to be a hereafter? Allahu A'lam, maybe they did. That only Allah knows that. But they struggled with the justice project of the Islamic Revolution. And so they, and we have tons of reports about this, they would play delay tactics. Okay, fine. I'm going to give the orphans their rights. Okay, fine. I'm going to support the wayfarers. Okay, but, just be, I have circumstances, I have situations, and so on. And the Quran repeatedly, as we will see, repeatedly comes and confronts them and exposes them and says, no, your problem is much more fundamental than you realize. Your problem is that you still are weak before Taghut. What is the worst Taghut? Your ego. What are the other Taghuts? Any time you submit to a despot, an oppressor, you submit to Taghut. Ignorance is Taghut. Anytime you submit to ignorance, that's Taghut. So the Quran comes and says, in reality, your tahakum, who you really, your real judge in life, who you really defer to, is not Allah and it's not the Prophet. And it's not the moral examples like Imam Ali, Radwanullah alayhi salam. These are not your moral examples. In reality, you are submitting to Taghut. So every time a person, Imam al-Qayyim says, you want to understand Taghut. Taghut is a superficial peel for shaitan. It's like within every Taghut is shaitan sitting at the heart. You just peel off Taghut, you'll find shaitan. So Taghut is everything that has shaitan in its heart. When your ego feels jealousy, feels envy, feels egotistical, feels selfish, when every shaitani force in existence, including all forms of oppression and injustice, that's Taghut. And that is why subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah says, وَقَدْ أُمِرُوا أَن يَكْفُرُوا بِهِ. They were told to reject the authority of Taghut in their life. And then it closes the loop for you and says, وَيُرِيدُ الشَّيْطَانُ أَن يُضِلَّهُمْ ضَلَالًا بَعِيدًا. That at the heart of this is shaitan. This is where Ibn Qayyim obviously gets the idea, right? That you peel off Taghut, you find at the heart shaitan. Now, the idea of Taghut itself, as we will see in Surah An-Nisa, is also critical because of another Quranic concept, and that's al-istidaf, the disempowered. Let's take a 5-minute break. So, moving on, وإذا قيل لهم تعالوا إلى ما أنزل الله وإلى الرسول رأيت المنافقين يصدون عنك صدودا فكيف إذا أصابتهم مصيبة بما قدمت أيديهم ثم جاءوك يحلفون بالله إن أردنا إلا إحسانا وتوفيقا أولئك الذين يعلم الله ما في قلوبهم فاعرض عنهم وعظهم وقل لهم في أنفسهم قولا بليغا. وما أرسلنا من رسول ليطاع بإذن الله إلا ليطاع بإذن الله ولو أنهم إذ ظلموا أنفسهم جاءوك فاستغفروا الله واستغفر لهم الرسول لوجدوا الله توابا رحيما فلا وربك لا يؤمنون حتى يحكموك فيما شجر بينهم ثم لا يجدوا في أنفسهم حرجا مما قضيت ويسلموا تسليما. ولو أن كتبنا عليهم أن اقتلوا أنفسكم أو اخرجوا من دياركم ما فعلوه إلا قليل منهم ولو أنهم فعلوا ما يوعظون به لكان خيرا لهم وأشد تثبيتا وإذا لأتيناهم من لدنا أجرا عظيما ولهديناهم صراطا مستقيما. Okay, so you notice from 60 up to 68. This is, as in Surah An-Nisa, we also see this in Surah after Surah An-Nisa. The reality, a reflection of the reality that it is not as we are often taught, that, you know, people convert to Islam at the time of the Prophet, ﷺ, and then it's a smooth sailing from there. But the actual struggle of people at the time of the Prophet with accepting the revolutionary changes that Islam came with. So, first, the Quran talks about those who are present in Medina and people who are their converts to Islam, which describes as munafiqeen, as the hypocrites. That when they are then told, here are all the changes that we have encountered in Surah An-Nisa, يصدون عنك صدودا, they resist, and they resist in a real way. So they are having let's see how Muhammad Asad is translating it. Yeah. He translated as the hypocrites turn away from thee with aversion. يصدون عنك صدودا, that they resist the entire project. They are often, we are accustomed to thinking of the hypocrites as like Abdullah ibn Ubay, who are sort of in in very real ways double agents. They say they are Muslim, but they are constantly conspiring against Muslims. But there's a different class of people who are not like Abdullah ibn Ubay, but their hypocrisy grows out of weakness. That it is not necessarily that they conspire against Muslims, but they find themselves unwilling, sometimes even unable, but most of the times unwilling to live by these dictates or live up to these dictates. And here's then the significance of then what follows, 62. So, how will they fare when a calamity befalls them because of what they have wrought in this world? Whereupon they will come to you swearing by God, our aim was but to do good and to bring about harmony. ما أردنا إلا إحسانا وتوفيقا. We often don't pause at this Quranic narrative, although it is extremely significant for all of us. Because, okay, so the calamity that will befall them by what the decisions they've made in life, although Muhammad Asad puts in brackets in that the calamity will befall them in the hereafter, as some Quranic commentators have noted, that it could have a dual meaning, that the calamity that will befall them in the hereafter, but the calamity that will also befall them in the failure of the moral project. In other words, the continuation of cycles of oppression and injustice. But the Quran alerts us to something that's very important, that they're not like Abdullah ibn Ubay, who are sort of sitting in the dark, conspiring and planning and with sinister. These people have convinced themselves that they're well-intentioned, that, we are doing what we can. But ultimately, they're lying to themselves, because their true God is a taghut. Their true system of authority and deference is not the moral principles. It is not understanding life as what trusts exist as amanat, what you owe others and what others owe to you. It is not an overarching project of justice. It is not the equal dignity and humanity of human beings that Surah Nisa starts out with. But it is wanting to have life continue largely the way it is, with minor changes. So now we go to the mosque and pray. Now we pay the zakah, a minimal amount, 2.5% over whatever. Now we, we might not consume alcohol. But fundamentally, the structure of life in terms of the way we relate to each other as human beings, in terms of the substantive project of justice, ethics, morality, hasn't changed. And it hasn't changed because they are thoroughly invested in themselves, for themselves. And so that excuse, ما أردنا إلا إحسانا وتوفيقا, it's like, listen, we didn't want, and this is the amazing power of the Quranic expression. ما أردنا إلا إحسانا. Okay, we wanted what was good. But إلا إحسانا وتوفيقا, that expression, توفيقا, meaning, to put it bluntly, Muhammad Asad translates it as, our aim was but to do good and to bring about harmony. And ask yourself, what harmony? What does that mean, harmony? What harmony? Illa tawfiqa, meaning we didn't want to challenge, we didn't want to rub elbows, we didn't want to bruise egos. The reason we failed in bringing about the change is that we didn't want to make the type of demands that are going to be disturbing to similarly situated people like us, people of privilege. Change meant upsetting your relatives when you share of the inheritance goes to taking care of people who worked for you. Relatives are going to be upset. They're going to say, why are you giving the maid money? Right? So let's avoid it. Let's not deal with it. If you give women their share in inheritance, the male, the tradition, culture, what is this? You're wasting the family's wealth on women who are going to be married to other men and take that wealth with them wherever they marry. It's going to upset people. You can't achieve what Surah Nisa is calling for without upsetting people. So when it says وَمَا أَرَدْنَا إِلَّا إِحْسَانًا وَتَوْفِيقًا, it's precisely that. Their excuse is, we just didn't want to hurt people's feelings. Come on. Seriously? Now we're in trouble because of that? Yeah. Because that's what's required. Okay. But notice the amazing thing. So what does it tell the Prophet to do about this weakness? It doesn't tell him imprison people, fight people, shame people, embarrass people. What it says is, Allah knows. Excuses might work with everyone, might work even with you, Prophet. Because Allah knows what is in their hearts. You don't. So, فَارِضْ عَنْهُمْ وَعِظْهُمْ وَقُلْ لَهُمْ فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ قَوْلًا بَلِيغًا. So what do? Turn away from them. Leave them alone. Admonish them. Admonish them here is wa'izhum, means advise them. Tell them, give them good advice. It's not admonish means punish them. Admonish means, wa'izhum means advise them correctly. وَقُلْ لَهُمْ فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ قَوْلًا بَلِيغًا. And Muhammad Asad's translation, speak unto them about themselves in a gravely searching manner. That when you talk to them, don't hold back in explaining, in exposing themselves to themselves. It is not about embarrassing them in front of other people. It is not about throwing them in prison, or although Allah knows these people to have hypocrisy in their heart and they're making excuses. Your job as a prophet, know that you can't count on them. They're not a part of the people who are going to bring about change. But and that's why you turn away from them, because they're not Imam Ali or Abu Bakr or Omar. They're not these people. They're not the people who are going to bring about change. But you owe them the truth. You can't just say, well, yeah, Allah will understand. You have to tell them you're weak. Your faith is weak. You submit to Taghut, and I'm just giving you advice and leaving it up to you. Only in the Quran that you find this subtlety. Because you're taught for those who say, now think about this, comes after وَأَطِيعُوا أُولِي الْأَمْرِ مِنْكُمْ. Those who want to turn this verse into obey those in power, the whole dynamic, the whole trajectory doesn't fit, because it is talking about moral authority and moral education, not coercive power. So even when it comes to the Prophet ﷺ himself, it doesn't say those people who are not obeying you, throw them in prison, torture them. It says you owe them truth. And other than that, turn away from them. Amazing. And then 64, and we have never sent any apostle save as he should be heeded by God's leave. If then after having sinned against themselves they would but come around to you and ask God to forgive, with the apostle too praying that they be forgiven, they would assuredly find that God is the acceptor of repentance and a dispenser of grace. What is it? What is the context for this? So you owe them the truth, but at the same time, they will quickly realize that there are those, and in fact, I'll tell you, at this point in Surah Nisa, it is a minority of society, not the majority. That there is a minority who truly get it and are fully committed to the Islamic project. Those folks will come to a point where they will feel the gap between those who are your true companions, your true followers, those who are committed heart and soul to the Islamic project, and their world and universe of excuses and weakness. And Allah simply tells them, understand that just because you're not coerced, because part of what these people were accustomed to is that kings, when they rule, they coerce. You obey me, you're good. You disobey me, I punish you. Biblical prophets were kings. The prophets they're accustomed to hearing about from Jews were also kings. Like Solomon, you owe me obedience. The prophet is something different. Although Allah tells them there are hypocrites, although there are people who are conspiring against them, like Abdullah ibn Ubay and other people like that, and although there are some who listen to the instruction of the Quran and they ignore it, he doesn't go after them. He relies on the truly committed. They understood this. They interpreted this as weakness. And their shayateen, their demons, would start whispering to them, well, where is the power? Where is the authoritativeness? Where is the absolutism? And Allah comes and says, understand, just because you are allowed to be, just because the Prophet doesn't go after you and persecute you, it doesn't mean that this apostle is not owed obedience. He is. But it is Allah's will, because this is the final prophet. And this is not what the Quran's about. I'm telling you because this is the final prophet, and we are beyond the age of miracles. It is humans who are going to make their moral future or break their moral future. It is the age of volition and choice. And so, yes, he gives you advice and he lets you go. He lets you be. If you had any brains, you would rush to him and ask Allah for forgiveness and ask him to pray for you so that Allah helps you become better human beings. The fact that you don't do that, that's on you. If you had any sense, this is what you would truly desire. You would come and confess your weakness and say, pray for us. Because then you would find Allah, in fact, most gracious. Allah would, in fact, help you get over yourselves. And understand, you want to understand what this is, what type of commitment and resolve is needed. Because you are asking yourself, well, what precisely, give us the bottom line. What does the Quran want from us? Well, if you want the standard for piety, the bar, if you will, if you want to meet the bar, that you would believe to the point that when you are told that this is right, you would do it. And look at it. ولا ثم لا يجدوا في أنفسهم حرجا, that they wouldn't find you wouldn't find in your hearts displeasure or unhappiness for having to do what's right. So, yes, Allah is requiring that you act against your base impulses, that you, in fact, rub elbows and sometimes upset people to do what's right. But if you're wondering what is it, what is the bar? The bar is that you say, okay, this is what God is telling us is right. I will do it happily. I will, in fact, find no displeasure in, because the displeasure is how you end up with the apologetics, how you end up justifying what's wrong for yourselves. And then it even Allah becomes clearer with them and says, although Surah An-Nisa doesn't say this explicitly, but these people had received by now Surah Al-Baqarah and Al-Umran, right? And Al-Baqarah, they remember that when Allah is talking to Jews, speaking to Jews, and it talks about how some Jews failed in rising to the level of carrying the trust that they've been given. And in Baqarah, Allah tells us that if these Israelites were told to kill themselves, the ultimate sacrifice, they wouldn't do it. And here, the same reference, it's like saying the type of moral commitment that Allah wants from Muhammad and his followers is the type of commitment where you would be willing to sacrifice your life, because obviously we already know about war and the battles, and there will be other battles, and these battles demand, there's no compulsory draft, it's all voluntary. It will demand that people, in fact, do exactly that. They join the army and run the risk of being killed or injured or maimed or crippled or whatever. أو خرجوا من دياركم. Forsake your homelands and your properties. This is, again, a clear reference to those who have, in fact, already done that. Those who migrated from Mecca, who in fact did forsake their homelands and everything they owned. So it's like saying, because again, if you don't understand the verse in its context, you end up with some very bizarre things. That ultimately ask yourself, you have examples, living examples at the time of people who are in fact willing to sacrifice their lives and did in fact sacrifice their families, their property. It can ask yourself, when you complain about, well, what's wrong with me? Why can't I be, part of the good guys, so to speak? Well, ask yourself, what is your level of commitment? What are you truly willing to sacrifice? In your struggles with a taghut, with your ego, and with other oppressive forces in life, do you really ask yourself whether you are willing if what is demanded of you is to give up your life or everything you own, including your homeland, if the answer, and only you can answer that, and only Allah knows the truth of the answer, if the answer is no, then it is no wonder that you are failing in this moral project. It is no wonder that you find yourself slipping into hypocrisy. And that's why it says, ما فعلوه إلا قليل منهم. Only a few of them would do it. And I've always been fascinated by the fact that it says a few of them would do it. That there's still a percentage that in fact they have that potential, but they're just a step away from it. That if they pose the right question, if they think to themselves, well, in order to really get my head on straight, I must be willing to sacrifice my life. And once that clicks, they're in. That's the qalilun minhum. That's the few of them. They're just a step away. But that's the minority. The majority will either never give themselves an honest answer, or even if they give themselves an honest answer, the answer will be, well, why is it necessary to be so drastic, so extreme? You know, why do we need to talk about sacrifice of life and everything and property? The nature of human beings is always, well, you know, haven't I given enough? Because we don't teach, if we just taught Sirah the right way, the actual stories of actual people, many of these people would go around saying, haven't we sacrificed enough? Come on, we've taken in these refugees from Mecca and we opened our homes to them. You know, jobs are more scarce. There's inflation. There's this, there's that. Now we are in war with Quraysh and Quraysh itself. Isn't it enough? Well, that's not how moral revolutions are achieved. It is, human beings can, you know, if the project is to generate numerous apologetics for failure, well, that's easy to do. And of course, ولو أنهم فعلوا ما يوعظون لكان خيرا ما يوعظون به لكان خيرا لهم وأشد تثبيتا. That if in fact they would have been willing to make this ultimate sacrifice, خيرا لهم, it would have been better for them. وأشد تثبيتا. This is the let's see how Muhammad Asad translates it, and he translates it as apt to strengthen them greatly in faith, which is as close, I guess, as you can get. وَأَشَدَّ تَثْبِيتًا means if they would ask themselves these difficult questions. Remember what I said about how moral thinking is a methodology. It's structured, orderly thinking. Well, أَثَدَّ تَثْبِيتًا exactly gets at that. If they would ask themselves these ultimate questions, it would become anchoring for them. It would structure them correctly. Because when they ask themselves the tough questions, and if they're able to give honest answers to the tough questions, then the process of morality itself would start unfolding. How deep is my commitment? And how clear is my vision? If you ultimately and honestly say, I'm willing to give up my life and everything I own for the principle, well, giving an orphan their due seems a small matter. Supporting refugees in society seems a small matter. Giving hired help a share of the inheritance seems a small matter. But it needs honest answers, because until these honest answers come, these matters will not be small. In fact, they will be everything to you, because you're all about your ego and all about yourself. And this is, of course, followed. وَإِذًا لَأَتَيْنَاهُمْ مِنْ لَدُنَّا أَجْرًا عَظِيمًا وَلَهَدَيْنَاهُمْ صِرَاطًا مُسْتَقِيمًا. So we would have indeed granted them out of our grace أَجْرًا عَظِيمًا. Here it's not just a reward, but it's like giving them from our grace success or the path forward, a windfall. وَلَهَدَيْنَاهُمْ صِرَاطًا مُسْتَقِيمًا. And they would indeed have been guided to the straight path. So, do you see, like a symphony of morality? It starts out with a principle, goes to the specific reforms and laws, draws back to these anchoring principle that, and then to the methodology of moral thinking itself. Okay. So then, 69, so that who obeys God and the Prophet, فأولئك مع الذين أنعم الله عليهم من النبيين والصديقين والشهداء والصالحين وحسن أولئك رفيقا. The only thing I want to say about 69 is, so if you structure the ayah, if you ask yourself what the ayah is, it's asking you, put differently, in what company, what is the company that you desire? There is the company of the prophets, was-siddiqeen, the apostles, if you will, and the martyrs, and as-salihin, the truly pious. There is that company. But in order to obtain this company, to be in that company, you have to understand what Allah and the Prophet being your true frame of reference is. We often teach our children وَمَنْ يُطِعِ اللَّهَ وَالرَّسُولَ as a matter of just obey. It is not, it is an impoverishment and stripping away of language when you put it that way. It's like you are bankrupting language. It is not about, oh, I obey Allah by, Allah says, pray X rak'ahs of sunnah, so I just pray. That's not it. Al-ta'a huna, the obedience here, is internalizing your real frame of reference, what you internalize as worthy of deference. And because you could do all the ritualistic acts, but you have no ta'ah. You follow the instructions, you pray, you do your salah, but there's nothing that moves in your heart. Do you think that's going to put you in the company of martyrs and apostles? And no. On the other hand, instead of 20 prayers a day, you could pray 5 prayers a day. The basics. You do just the basics. 5 prayers a day. But Allah and the Prophet fill your heart. You are much better shape. Al-ta'ah is to what extent do they actually inhabit your heart, and to what extent do they actually, are you an embodiment of what they are? So it's like saying, what company do you want? It's one thing if you say, I shoot for the stars and I might end up settling for less. I might want to be in the company of the golden standard. But it is very dangerous to say, well, they're unreachable, and so I will take much less, because the likelihood is where you're going to be settled, where you're going to end up is even less than the less. And then you're in trouble. So at least when you say, yeah, I understand the concept. I must understand that whether we acknowledge it or not, we are always submitting to something. In the same way that you submit to the physical laws of creation, to the laws of gravity, the laws of deterioration, you whether you like it or not, you are submitting to the laws of aging. You're going to get older. You will find your looks changing, whether you like it or not. Your skin, your hair, your bones are all going to change, whether you like it or not. The nature of creation is that there will always be submission. And if you are not submitting to God, you are submitting to the other than God. Meaning, in most cases, it's the ego. The natural fallback taghut is the ego. You're not submitting to God, you are submitting to your ego. So submission is going to happen. But it is whether, if you are conscientious of that and deliberate of that, and you say, what am I truly submitting to? I don't want to submit to taghut. I don't want to be ultimately in submission to my ego. I don't want to submit to the demonic. I don't want to submit to to godlessness, to the lack of the godly. And you strive for the higher. That it's a at least, and you say, well, it is not just about being an imitator, a blind follower of actions without comprehension. So my heart is a project that I am constantly investing in, and purification of the soul is a project that I am constantly engaging in. if worse comes to worse, if nothing else, at least what you will have at least appealing for you in the hereafter is your best efforts. Maybe I failed completely, but at least I tried my best, and Allah knows that you tried your best. Even if you constantly failed. Who's better? Someone who always tried their best, even though the results ultimately were extremely unsatisfactory, but they've always worked hard. Or someone who never worked hard, but just found themselves easily doing what looks like piety. Ask yourself, what is the nature of piety? If someone says, I was born taught never to sin, and I lived and died and never sinned, and they come in the hereafter, and it was all easy for them. They've never sinned because they've never had the temptation to sin. As opposed to someone who always had the temptation and always struggled with the temptation, sometimes succeeded, sometimes failed. What does Allah reward? It is the effort. It is the struggle. It is the deliberation. It's the hard work. It would be grossly inequitable to reward that who was born without temptation and never failed. That's not an achievement. It just is. Okay. So then we come to, so this is 69, 70 of course is ذلك الفضل من الله وكفى بالله عليما. That it's sort of it brings the idea to a closing statement. This is the true goodness from Allah. To understand this moral lesson that Allah has carried you through to this point. Okay. Then at 71, Surah Nisa now shifts. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So it shifts, but it's still, because now it's going to talk about the war effort, but it still is dealing with the challenges that Muslims are confronting in Medina at the time. So look. So, يا أيها الذين آمنوا خذوا حذركم. So, you know, be aware of the dangers that surround you. Be prepared. Be on guard. You are, Allah knows that there are so many surrounding you who are ready to pounce on you to destroy your small nascent community. And understand that in order to repel this danger, it would require that there will be small expeditions, if you will, that sometimes small, specific groups of you will be called upon to accomplish military actions, and sometimes, and this is فانفروا ثبات أو انفروا جميعا, that sometimes in units of you or small groups of you will be called upon to take action, and sometimes all of you, or this will be a collective effort, a major effort for large numbers. Because the reality, of course, is that, every time you are going to have some type of action that involves specific individuals, it's straightforward enough if you just call for volunteers. But if the Prophet ﷺ calls upon specific individuals in the community, well, depending on the perspective, right, what is the risk? Is that, human beings start getting into the usual stuff that human being gets called upon. Well, why are these people called upon more than others? Why are these specific individuals carrying a greater share of the weight than, and especially the families and loved ones of these individuals? Oh, why is it that you have to always go out on these, so it's sort of a lot, in a few words, lays it out, just sort of the honesty and the it's just refreshing. It's just like, it's going to take some specific groups of you, and it's going to take major efforts of you, or more collective efforts. Anyway, so, but then, this is now, we are at, what is it, 72, yeah. But there are indeed some of you, or there are among you, those لَيُبَطِّئَنَّ, those who would lag behind, and then when a calamity befalls you, when it doesn't go well, they say, God has bestowed a favor upon us that we weren't with them. وَلَئِنْ أَصَابَكُمْ فَضْلٌ مِّنَ اللَّهِ لَيَقُولَنَّ كَأَنْ لَمْ تَكُنْ بَيْنَكُمْ وَبَيْنَهُ مَوَدَّةٌ يَا لَيْتَنِي كُنْتُ مَعَهُمْ فَأَفُوزُ فَوْزًا عَظِيمًا. But if it goes well, if the expedition actually ends well, these same people would say, oh, I wish I was with them, so I would have triumphed. But look at the interjection here. As if there had never been any question of love between you and him. Okay, so what is it talking about? It's describing, and it's talking about irreality. There are, again, those who became Muslim, but the way that they are interacting with the fate of the ummah, with the challenges of this community, with the troubles, both the victories and the defeats, is not is itself contradictory to the idea that they have truly embraced this community. Yes, they've taken the Shahada. Yes, they're officially Muslim. But when they see a military effort going on, they are the first to make excuses not to be a part of those who sacrifice. So, to in fact lag behind. Now, the excuses could be that people came up with all types of excuses. And again, I think we miss out when we don't teach our children that real life dynamics. That some people would come to the Prophet ﷺ and say, "Oh, my child woke up today with a fever. I can't go." Making excuses. Now, of course, they think that they're fooling. I mean, they're lying to the Prophet. And only Allah knows whether Allah tells the Prophet that they're lying or not, but Allah knows they're lying. But human beings are human beings. They're not going to say, we're cowards, we don't want to go out to fight. They're going to say, I'm talking about real excuses from Islamic history. Oh, my children are sick. Oh, my wife is ill. She suddenly became very ill, and I'm very worried about her. Oh, Prophet, can you pray for her? I can't leave her. Can I? And the Prophet ﷺ, remarkably, I think he knew they were lying. But he would never say, stop making excuses and go join the military expedition. He would just nod his head and say, oh, Prophet, pray for her. Pray for her that she gets well. May Allah heal everyone. That's what the Prophet ﷺ would say. And just turn away. And I think he knew they were lying. Sometimes excuses were, oh, I have a caravan, a trade that is about to arrive, and if I'm not here, they're going to rob me dry. And if I'm not here to make sure that the caravan is properly unloaded and the merchandise is accounted for, my children are going to go hungry. Prophet, do I have an excuse not to join the military expedition? The Prophet wouldn't say anything. But Allah knows. And so, but when then the expedition doesn't go well, these people in closed circles, not with the likes of Imam Ali or Abu Bakr and so on, they don't go to the close companions of the Prophet, but in closed circles, they would say, wow, look, I had a feeling this is not going to go well. That's why so in other words, it would become bragging rights about how wise they are and how they were sagacious. Oh, I knew. What is this? Muhammad is sending another expedition. I don't know what to do this or do that. And I wish he would have talked to me. I'm telling you for actual events from Islamic history. I wish he would have talked to me. I would have told him not to do it. That's why I wasn't eager to join them. Yeah, I know I went and told him that my son was sick, but it's because I knew it wasn't going to go well. Human beings are human beings. You can imagine this happening in our day and age. That's the way human beings are, and especially when they are egotistical and weak. Oh, I knew this was unwise from the beginning. Now, on the other hand, if things go the other way, they come and say, yeah, it went well, but I'm from actual examples. oh, I didn't realize this was going to be an important expedition. If they would have told me how important this is, I would have joined them. And you know what? Whatever success they achieved, they would have done much more. It would have gone so much better if I was there. If the Prophet would have just talked to me and explained to me what he was about, what he was up to. The classic egotistical nonsense of egotistical human beings. 1400 years ago, it smelled bad. 1400 years later, it still smells bad. If I had deeper perception, I have insight, if it was up to me. They are deeply, and Allah sums it up by calling them hypocrites. They lie to themselves, they lie to God, and they are hypocrites. Okay. Now, and so go back to that phrase, كأن لم تكن بينكم وبينه مودة. They fundamentally, they are not speaking out of a real sense of passion for their community. They are individuals that are egocentric. It is all about whether the failure or the success makes them look good or bad. It is not about a true sense of sadness for the failure and a true sense of happiness for the success. That is what that expression means. Just as if there had never been any question of love between you and him. Now here, the him, a lot of people assume that it's speaking about a specific individual. I've researched this, and what's remarkable is even the reports don't tell us that there is a specific individual. It is speaking about a prototype. They measure everything in terms of how it has an impact on me. It's the me that is the center, not the actual community, whether it, and it's, again, it just lays things bare. It's like exposing for those who reflect, and as it will see, Allah comes later on and says, reflect upon this, because you will see that this lays bare everything for you. Okay. And then فليقاتل في سبيل الله الذين يشرون الحياة الدنيا بالآخرة ومن يقاتل في سبيل الله فيقتل أو يغلب فسوف نؤتيه أجرا عظيما. The bottom line is Allah's command is the willingness to sacrifice yourself when there is a call for arms. Fight in Allah's sake, and understand that if you do so, your commitment has to be for your reward with Allah. That the goal is either victory or ultimate sacrifice. And you must understand that now, but then it comes to like the heart. Every surah has a heart, like where the pulsing heart of the surah. And this is the pulsating heart of Surah An-Nisa. Why is it that Allah wants you to fight? Why is it that you are fighting at all? Why is there a call to arms? وما لكم لا تقاتلون في سبيل الله والمستضعفين من الرجال والنساء والولدان الذين يقولون ربنا اخرجنا من هذه القرية الظالم أهلها واجعل لنا من لدنك وليا واجعل لنا من لدنك نصيرا الذين آمنوا يقاتلون في سبيل الله والذين كفروا يقاتلون في سبيل الطاغوت فقاتلوا أولياء الشيطان إن كيد الشيطان كان ضعيفا. Okay, so this is 75 and 76. So what is this fighting about? The fighting في سبيل الله, but Allah gets, in the same way that Allah gets nothing from our worship, it adds nothing to Allah. Any war effort adds nothing to Allah as it takes nothing from Allah. So what does fighting in Allah's sake mean? And here, wow, harf al-atf is what gives us what Allah, the stand-in, Allah as a, we fight for Allah for a purpose, that there is, the benefit goes to an object other than Allah. And the fighting here is في والمستضعفين, the disempowered, the oppressed men and women. So this is now the who cry, our sustainer, lead us to freedom out of this land whose people are oppressors, and raise for us out of your grace a protector, and raise for us out of your grace one who will bring us succor. Okay. So the fighting, the objective of the fighting is to benefit or to serve the interests of men and women and children who are oppressed. The nature of oppression is the bitter feeling of injustice. So those who are oppressed often dream of being liberated from their oppression. How do they articulate this dream? Is that they will often supplicate to God, God, either bring this oppression to an end, help us to escape from this unjust land, or God, send us a protector. Because often, and I'll come to that. Okay. Send us a protector. And send us, as Muhammad Asad puts it, a succor, meaning a nasir, someone who comes to our aid. The way modern Muslims approach this ayah, they often give you the impression that this ayah basically is talking about Mecca and the oppression in Mecca, but think about it. Fight for the sake of Allah. What does that mean? Fight with the objective of helping those who are suffering oppression. Those who are suffering oppression dream that the injustice that they are suffering will come to an end. They dream either to escape the land, to escape from their oppressors, or dream or actually pray to Allah that Allah would send them a protector and someone who would come to their aid and their victory, or a victor of some kind, a nasir. Well, most Muslims have migrated from Mecca already when Surah Nisa is revealed. There is a percentage of Muslims who are still living in Mecca, as we will see. But the fighting that Muslims are engaged in is not so that this small group of people will be let go. It's not that Muslims are fighting the Meccans and saying, we will continue fighting you until you let go of these people. That's not what the fighting is about. In fact, as we will see, most of the Muslims who still remained in Mecca, they still remained in Mecca voluntarily. They didn't want to leave because many of them, to put it bluntly, didn't want to make the sacrifice of leaving behind everything they own. And as a result, the Quran comes and condemns them for that, as we will see. So to try to make this ayah all about, it's just, it's about talking to the Meccans. It doesn't fit. Doesn't work. When you delve into everything surrounding Surah Nisa generally, but this portion of Surah Nisa specifically, at this point, the Prophet ﷺ and those who migrated from Mecca and the natives who supported the Prophet in Medina had become a symbol of empowerment and liberation for all types of people in Arabia and beyond even Arabia, in Persia, for instance, even in Abyssinia for some. A symbol of liberation of oppressive systems. And when, even as we will see, Muslims when the Copts in Egypt or the populations living under Byzantine oppression in Syria communicate with Muslims. And this is unfortunately, again, because we don't tell our own history. And we tell it in terms of just demagoguery and rhetoric instead of specific, concrete examples. Muslims are seen as native liberators. They are a movement that grows out of the soil of this area. In other words, native populations that have lived dominated and controlled and oppressed by systems of power that has existed for a long time. And at the time, the Quran comes and reinforces this idea, and we will see everything the Surah An-Nisa says about war, and I'll show you how the entire message about war just adds and complements that critical point. Understand that the reason Allah called you to arms and the reason you fight your battles, as we've already established, it is not about the spoils of war. And if it is about the spoils of war, then Allah doesn't want you to fight for it. Allah doesn't want your effort. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ refused to allow those who did not understand what the Islamic project was about, so kuffar, people who did not convert Islam, who came to the Prophet, said, we want to support you, we want to help you. And the Prophet said, no, I'm sorry. Only people who are committed to what this is about can take part in what we're doing. There is a point about this ayah that I think transcended the age in which it was revealed. Those who were receiving it might not have been well placed to even understand fully what it's talking about. But this is quintessentially an ethical revolution. This is a message about an ethical and ethically committed way of life, a moral philosophy. If that moral philosophy resorts to violence, it must be for purposes of liberation consistent with this moral philosophy. Otherwise, the war is unjust. And that's precisely why many of the early invasions or early wars by the Umayyads, the first dynasty, or even the second dynasty, the Abbasids, were opposed by Ahlul Bayt. Because these were not wars of liberation, these were imperial wars. They were wars about invasion, empire, building an empire. But the ideal is that war must have a clear moral objective. Liberating the oppressed. Because the oppressed will not always be able to escape oppression by simply migrating. It might be wherever they migrate, he will always confront the same oppression. But what they truly dream of are protectors. And your job is to be these protectors. Because Allah acts through you. In my view, this puts in very serious question tribal wars, nationalistic wars, wars over, all the things that typically people have gone to war over. War is a very drastic step that needs clear moral objectives. And the only moral war is the wars that are fought to liberate oppressed people. Or, of course, war that are forced upon you in self-defense. But beyond that, it's sort of this clear, and we'll see in the rest of Surah An-Nisa, this remarkable clarity in moral vision. That the reason the Prophet ﷺ was given permission to use force is because without the use of this force, that moral revolution, this ethical revolution that we are talking about will not succeed. And you understand that and you join it for the right purposes, or there is a problem. Okay. And understand that fighting in fi sabilillah, in the sake of Allah, how to put it? Well, okay, so this is, I'm talking about 76. So the translation first. Those who attain to faith fight in the cause of God, where those who are bent on denying the truth fight in the cause of al-taghut, or Muhammad Asad translates it as powers of evil. Fight then against those friends of Satan. Verily, Satan's guile is weak indeed. Okay, so الذين آمنوا يقاتلون في سبيل الله. So perhaps the way we should approach it is, again, if we want a orderly way of approaching it, say, to fight in the sake of Taghut is never consistent with fighting for the sake of God. It's like you are juxtaposing, on the one hand, fighting for sake of God, juxtaposed to its opposite, fighting for the sake of Taghut. So, those who are true believers, not what the Quran describes as hypocrites. Did the hypocrites sometimes join the war effort? Well, if they came to the Prophet and said, we are believers and we want to fight, the Prophet wasn't allowed to say, well, I know what is in your heart and you're not allowed to fight with me. But Allah knows. So Allah comes and says to them, understand that the real believers, and remember that many of you are hypocrites, but the real believers, when they fight, they don't fight for gain. They don't fight for their ego. They don't fight for prestige. They don't fight for power. They fight for Allah's sake. And what did we just learn about Allah's sake? For the sake of coming to the aid of the disempowered, for just causes, to help the oppressed. This is juxtaposed to those who don't understand what fighting in Allah's sake is about. They fight for the sake of Taghut. You see, the way we often approach this verse is that we say, oh, well, yeah, it's saying that everyone that fights with Muhammad is fighting for Allah's sake. And everyone that's fighting against Muhammad is fighting for Taghut. But that's not what it's saying. It is saying those who truly believe. So there could be people fighting with Muhammad who are in fact not fighting for Allah's sake. The hypocrites among them. Anyone who fights for the wrong reasons is fighting for Taghut. That Taghut, okay, so if fighting for the spoils of war, let me put it to you this way. Fighting for spoils of war, is that Taghut? Intuitively, you'd say yes, of course. Fighting because you want to be known as the bravest and most, the greatest killer of all. And the night of nights. Is that Taghut? That's egocentric, yes. If you are fighting for nationalistic reasons, tribal reasons, the honor or the reputation of your family, fighting because you want to, for reasons of conquest and sex and, things like that. All of this is Taghut. This, unfortunately, many commentators, especially from later periods, people writing under the shadow of empire, ignored these aspects. But you find still within the Islamic tradition moralistic thinkers who still preserve the pristine original meaning of these verses and tell you that many battles fought in the name of Islam were actually battles for Taghut. Many of the reports that expose the Taghuti objectives of much of the violence committed came by the way of Ahlul Bayt. That's undeniable. Unfortunately, Sunni Muslims often, in their zeal to oppose the Shia, ignore the tradition of the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. But when you look at the traditions of Ahlul Bayt and what they were saying about warfare and what's illegitimate war or an illegitimate war, it's undeniable. That is why Umar bin Abdul Aziz, the Umayyad Khalifa, when he came to power, the only pious Umayyad Khalifa, he stopped all the invasions. He suspended all the war efforts because he knew that they were for Taghuti purposes. It is historically understandable because that's the way empires acted. Back then, even, look, the United States acts like an empire. Even in our day, the United States goes around using violence around the world, and no one dares say anything to the U.S. It pretty much justifies its use of violence after the fact. It feels like invading Afghanistan and invades Afghanistan. It feels like invading Iraq. It feels like, exploding bombs all over the world and having military. It does it at will. So it is not just something of the past. Even with the UN Charter and all of that, empires still act with an amazing amount of arrogance and entitlement. But the Quranic project was ahead of its historical moment. It was demanding of its people what they couldn't deliver historically after the death of the Prophet. It was beyond their ability because they were limited by their historical circumstance. And that is why it is also very dangerous to limit the Quranic project to the golden age of the Prophet and the rightly guided caliphs. Because the Quranic project transcends, its morality transcends the limitations of the time of the Prophet and the limitations of the golden age of Islam, the rightly guided caliphs. It is not a cap on morality. When someone comes and says, oh, well, but the companions did X, Y, and Z. No. We start with the Quran, and then we evaluate what the companions did in light of the Quran. We don't evaluate what the Quran demands in light of what the companions did. You've got it upside down. You've got it mixed up. The Prophet ﷺ was a human being. In the same way that the Prophet couldn't talk to us about airplanes and rockets and submarines. When the Prophet spoke as superhuman when he was receiving revelation. But as a human being, he was embedded in his epistemological moment. The Quran as revelation transcends its historical moment. There is no cap on the moral power of the Quran. That is why the moral lessons of the Quran could convince me that slavery is haram, even if it wasn't haram at the time of the Prophet. So what? That it wasn't haram at the time of the Prophet. The question is, what does the Quran say? What does the Quran say about عتق الرقبة? That's the moral trajectory of the Quran. And if it says عتق الرقبة is a moral good, and the opposite of عتق الرقبة is a moral bad, خلاص. Even if it goes beyond what the Prophet ﷺ, he did what he could do within the limits of systems of knowledge of his age. The Quran has no limits. It is a text of limitless power. And the irony is, those people who claim to be opposed to the historization of the Quran, no, it's not that. They're just ignorant of history. They're just ignorant people about history. Understanding the historical context of the Quran is critical to understanding the moral power beyond the historical context. We study history to understand the limitations of history, not the limitations of the Quran. We study history to understand the limitations of history, not the limitations of the Quran. So when someone goes, why do we need to understand the historical? Because you need to understand what the Quran was describing and what the Quran wants people to achieve beyond the historical moment. What time is it? Oh, okay, we're over. Okay. Okay, so this is one final comment, and then we'll stop we'll start inshallah with 77 next time. Notice that in 76, Allah parallels between fighting for Taghut and being awliya al-shaytan, being the allies or companions of Satan. Because war itself unless war is fought for clearly moral purposes, war is a moral evil. Violence is demonic unless it has clear moral objectives. So it's like, why can I punish someone? If I come and I restrict someone's freedom, by its nature, jailing someone, imprisoning someone is a moral evil. To take someone's freedom, that is a moral evil. The only time it can go from a moral evil to an actual moral good is that if it is a just reward for wrongs committed by this person. And then we'd say, and then it has to be measured, and it has to be proportional, and it has to be fair. Otherwise, it goes from moral good to moral evil. War is like that. It has to have clear moral objectives, clear moral purposes, not just in objectives, but in execution. Otherwise, it's demonic. And that is why violence and war is a very dangerous thing. If it is that, and that is, the moral, because the Quran is a living document for real human beings. It is not, going to tell you, just suffer in silence, and even self-defense is immoral, or, someone strikes you on the right cheek, gives them your left cheek. That's immoral in itself, because failure to come to the aid of the oppressed is immoral. Allowing people to just suffer injustice and suffer taghut is demonic. The demonic celebrates when people just accepts the supremacy of the demonic. Sometimes we will need to push back the demonic, even if we have to do so through the use of force. But lack of moral vigilance, if force is used, is extremely dangerous, because it easily slips in its opposite. Okay, inshallah, next halaqah we start with 76. And again, I wanted to move faster, but Surah Nisa is probably, in terms of the moral revolution that is at the heart and core of the Islamic message, Surah Nisa is one of the most constitutional and foundational surah. Okay, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen.
Okay, alhamdulillah. This was absolutely incredible. We covered so much ground in such a short amount of time, and I just hope that I can point out a few highlights, because there's so much. Obviously there are a lot of really important insights of information that, you took us through so much history, background, and I think what was also extremely powerful is just recognizing the human emotions and the human tendencies that we recognize in our own time that become very apparent. But just to start with, like some of the ideas, for example, of, companions being all perfect. This is something that I know that as a convert was a very strong impression. This idea of, we want to go back to the golden age where everything was perfect and that the companions were perfect. And, just to know that, no, these are people who struggled. There was a wide range of people that, you could take a very truthful position and be honest about that, or you can cover over and try and say that no, these things that were immoral, it's not really as we understand it. And so just even having us understand this nuance and this approach and these distinctions is extremely powerful. Like so many of the other halakas we've covered, it's just to like give us that layer of nuance, gives us, I think, a lot more confidence and just insight into our history. So it's not so theoretical. And again, delving into hadith reports and how a lot of them were, political, fabricated. That there's a history that you have to be much more discerning about the reports that you hear. The idea of when you started us out at the beginning about the distinction between law and ethics, and how law, obviously, like the message from the Quran has to go way beyond the law, but to move what is in your heart and your soul and your spirit, but that how oftentimes now we kind of get that wrong, where law comes before or supersedes ethics. And how so much of it is tied to even our ego and struggling with tagut, and how it's really so much about the transformation. Okay, let me just go back. That tagut and ego or tagut is often a cover for shaitan, and how we struggle with envy and weakness. Honestly, it just comes down to our own weakness and our own level of commitment. The beautiful, completely mind-blowing discussion on trust, amanat, what that you are about, what trusts are owed to you, and what you owe to others. And the example you said, it's not just about borrowing someone's vacuum cleaner and returning it, but it's like everything in life, every relationship in life. Whether it's smiling at someone, whether it's taking care of someone, what is the trust that you owe, and what is owed to you, and that you owe to others. It's like hard to fully grapple with, but it's so expansive and mind-blowing that it's something that we obviously need to spend a lot of time reflecting on, and that ultimately it's about substantive justice. God gave you something so beautiful, and just the idea, trying to grapple with it in your brain is it's just so huge. It's such a revolution, as you've underscored. And that a lot of this really comes down to our own personal commitment, and what are you willing to actually sacrifice? Are you willing to subscribe to this moral project and 100% be with it, do it, be okay with upsetting people? Or are you going to give in to your ego, to your weakness, to your excuses, your justifications? It was really valuable to just, again, talk us through moral thinking, structured, orderly thinking, methodology. What does it mean to educate yourself with a methodology? Okay, let me just see. And ultimately that, Allah knows what's in your heart. It's really interesting to know about how when the Prophet, in the past it was that, people were really forced to submit, but that the Prophet was not about forcing people, but it was really, now we've gone beyond the age of, sorry, I left my notes. It's really not about coercion anymore, but really about choice. And that, because people are going to make excuses, really, the answer is to just, turn from them. You owe them the truth. Allah knows what's in their hearts. It's really up to people to decide, what is your level of sacrifice? Who is the company that you want to keep? Are you going to, what inhabits your heart? And, are you going to lie to yourselves and God? I mean, God knows everything. And again, there's just so much, oh my gosh, fighting about, that there has to be a clear moral objective or self-defense, that really the only just reason for fighting is liberating the oppressed. And, you know, all the discussion about really what you started also talking about before is imperial Islam versus Quranic Islam, and how much was done in the name of power and authority as opposed to justice. And then, of course, the most important message, that the Quran is a text of limitless power that goes far beyond any historical moment. And just trying to understand that there's so much potential that to be unleashed in every age. I mean, for us in our time, I mean, we have, like, you know, everything that you take us through, to me personally, it makes it so clear how difficult this test was for them, because it's like God ratcheted up, you know, the standard with every turn, and it's kind of like you're walking in the dark and God is telling you, you need to do this, okay, now you need to do that. For us, it's like we can look back and we can see the history and we can see the progression of people, we can see how difficult it was, and yet at the same time we can see also how these same challenges are so relevant and so, like, important for us in our day and age, you know, at every level, from whether it's state level, you know, standing up to power, versus just looking at, you know, fellow Muslims, right? Because you have a lot of people who say that they're Muslim, but are they really willing to sacrifice? And we have to ask ourselves, are we really willing to sacrifice? Are we lying to ourselves? Are we being truthful? Are we making up excuses? Because, you know, every Friday you challenge people who are listening in the khutbahs to the things that need to be done. And, you know, when you say, okay, when you ask yourself, what are you really willing to sacrifice? Are you willing to give up your life and everything you own for this particular cause? You know, these are really difficult questions when, you know, people even are not even willing to sacrifice their time to read a book. You know, these are incredible things that are so insightful and really, I think, cut to the core of what it means to be Muslim. So, I mean, I feel really grateful, and that as hard as this message is, it's like so clear, and, you know, in one way it's sort of easy because you understand what is the right way, and on the other hand it's extremely difficult because it requires a lot of sacrifice and a lot of thought. But thank you so much, because we don't hear this anywhere else, and you know, it's such a gift, honestly. So alhamdulillah, thank you everybody for being with us, and I'm so looking forward to next week again, inshallah. But tomorrow again, just a reminder, join us for 4 o'clock tomorrow in the afternoon conversation with the Sheikh in the Noor Center. Yeah, so thank you. I'm like overwhelmed. Have a wonderful rest of the night, and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow online, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.